Amid tensions over Iran's nuclear program, the US has informed Israeli defense officials that it will not be able to supply them with new refueling tankers until late 2024. It's reported that Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who was here in Washington only last week, wanted his US counterpart Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to deliver the Boeing KC-46 refueling planes as rapidly as possible. But the United States says the jets cannot be delivered for the next few years. The tankers are a multi-mission aircraft. They're capable of transporting fuel, cargo and passengers, and they can refuel Allied and military aircraft that are compatible with international aerial refueling procedures. The aircraft can also detect, avoid, defeat and survive threats using multiple layers of force protection. Israel ordered the new tankers back in March, hoping to add them to its existing fleet amid growing tensions with Iran. Israel's current fleet is more than 50 years old. It's based on the Boeing 707. The new fleet of tankers would give Israel far more range and ability. There are other tensions evident between the US and Israel. In discussions with Israeli diplomats, the Biden administration said that it puts the issue of settlements in the Palestinian territories on the same level as the Iranian nuclear threat. Those comments did not sit well with Israeli officials. WION's correspondent Jody Cohen spoke to Helit Burrell, an expert on US-Israel relations and the former head of the Council for Peace and Security. Here's what he had to say on the growing tensions between Israel and the Biden administration.
Helit, the US has reportedly told Israel that new refueling planes won't be ready until 2024. Now, these are crucial to a potential strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. What is the US's thinking behind this?
Well, I think, first of all, there's an actual, just realistically, a problem with production and means, and there's competition in the United States. There are requirements by the Air Force as well for these tankers. And at this time, it doesn't seem like the United States wants Israel to take any action on its own, regardless. But it's important to remember that while these tankers would definitely enhance Israeli capacity, doesn't mean Israel doesn't have capacity or tankers and has not already been planning such operations, even without the new equipment.
So I was going to ask you about that. Actually, does Israel have the capacity to target Iran's nuclear sites with its current capabilities? And are Israel and the US on the same page when it comes to taking military action to prevent Iran from achieving a nuclear bomb? And how do their approaches differ?
Well, first, there is certainly a debate, an open debate in Israel about whether or not a strike is operationally feasible. That Israel has operational capabilities, I think, is obvious. The question, of course, is to what extent. So is this, I think everybody is on the same page that this is not a similar scenario to an attack in Iraq in the 1980s, where you take out the nuclear program completely. So the question is, what do you achieve? And is it worth what the consequences might be, which might be a regional war using Iran's proxies of Hezbollah in Gaza against Israel, so on and so forth. So it's an open debate. That operational capacity exists, absolutely it does. The question is to what extent and how much would that strike be worth? With regards to the United States and Israel, I think it's clear that at this time, they are not, there is no full coordination on the issue of a strike, but it's important to remember that as the JCPOA, the talks in Vienna are progressing or not so much progressing, the United States, along with other allies, are looking at alternative options. This is not an Israeli issue. That Israel is more advanced in its thinking on that, and that Israel thinks that this needs to be a far more immediate and realistic option, I think is clear. But this is not to say that the United States and European allies, Britain in particular, are far from those lines of thinking, depending on how these talks progress. So far, it has not been promising.